بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. I mentioned yesterday about the science of Tasawwuf has two aspects. One is conformity. It's really fiqh al-batin. Just like you have fiqh al-zahir, like you have the fiqh of doing wudu, then you have fiqh al-batin, which relates to the niyyah, the ikhlas, the khushu' in the prayer, that you're actually present in the prayer. So it relates to those elements of the religion that are not external. Because you have Islam, which is the external, and then you have Iman, which is the vertical component of the external. Because Iman and Islam go together. In religious tradition, you talk about vertical and horizontal traditions. So the horizontal is the Islam. It's how you relate to other people and what you do outwardly. Islam is an outward phenomenon. Although Islam covers Iman and Ihsan, it has that general meaning. But it's also an outward phenomenon. So like in the Quran when it says قَالَتَ الْعَرَابُ آمَنَّا, the desert Arabs, they say we believe. And Allah says don't say we believe. وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلَ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ لا تقولوا آمنا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. Don't say we believe, but say we are in a state of Islam. So we're Muslims. Don't say we're mu'minun. And there's a khilaf about making that claim, and the Ash'aris and the Maturidis have a khilaf about that. Because the Ash'aris say, you say ana mu'min jazman. And the Maturidis say, no, you say ana mu'minun insha'Allah. And the difference is the Ash'aris believe that shaqawa and sa'ada are permanent states, whereas the Maturidi believe they're not. They're actual individual states. So you can be a mu'min at one time and become a kafir at another time. And that's a difference. And that's why, according to the one madhab, you can't make takfir of anybody in that way, because you don't know what their state is with God. So if you see a person who's not a Muslim, he might be a mu'min 'inda Allah. So you shouldn't make the false assumption that it's a kafir. And that's why if you look at the Sahaba, when they talked, they don't call people kafir. They say, Ya adu Allah, O enemy of God, or Ya adu wa nafsika. They would say things like that. They wouldn't say, Ya kafir. Because Allahu Alam, they might become Muslim. Like Abu Sufyan, when he was fighting the Prophet, the reality he was a mu'min. He didn't know it yet, but Allah knew it. So that's a type of difference of opinion about people's states. The akhlaq, or trying to conform outwardly, and then you have the inward, the iman, which is the vertical. That's what connects you to Allah. So the Islam becomes meaningful in its celestial dimension. Because a munafiq can practice Islam. So outwardly you can see all the things of a munafiq and you think they're Muslim, but there's no vertical connection. It's a horizontal phenomenon. And the iman introduces the vertical connection. And then the ihsan is the depth of it. It brings in the third dimension of depth. So it brings depth to that vertical connection. Because the iman is moving towards completion. So you can have iman as a continuum. And this again is a khilaf. Abu Hanifa said iman doesn't increase or decrease. And that when it says that in the Quran, zadathum imana, it doesn't mean like they got more iman, they just got more things to believe in. But he considered iman to be one thing. And you either had it or you didn't. And so the increase in iman is not really an increase in the phenomenon of belief. It's just an increase in what you believe in. So the more you believe in, the more you have iman in. Like once somebody teaches you to believe that the Prophet ﷺ is the best of creation. So you believe that. If you didn't know that before, you've increased your dimension of iman. But the reality of iman is the same. That's Abu Hanifa's position. The other position, which is the dominant position, is that iman increases. وَرُجِّحَتْ زِيَادَةُ الْإِيمَانِ بِمَا تَزِيدُ طَاعَةُ الْإِنسَانِ. That the preferred opinion is the increase of Iman based upon increase in obedience. So the more obedience, the bigger the Iman. So if you put the Iman of Abu Bakr in one kufa, like the Prophet said, and the Iman of the rest of the Ummah, with the exception of his Iman, Abu Bakr's Iman would outweigh the entire Ummah. So the Iman of a person differs. So increasing Iman, that's what Ihsan is about. Increasing the dimension of Iman. The Iman is the vertical connection, but now you're increasing the actual space of Iman. It's becoming bigger. It's taking on more depth. And that's really what this science is about. It's about increasing, the Quran talks about sharh al-sadr, sharahna sadrak. We expanded your breast. That expansion is to enable the Iman to have room. So the more you grow, the more expansion, spiritual expansion in your heart that you get. And so that aspect is, so you have the conformity, which is the outward aspect of tasawwuf. Good character, adab with people, humility, all those type of things. But then you have, and that's what they call akhlaq. That's akhlaq. So really, tasawwuf, part of it is the science of ethics. It's what in the West they call ethics. How to be a virtuous human being. And then you have another aspect which is called adwaq, which is the actual tasting of spiritual states. So, for instance, we know many examples of the Sahaba where, for instance, the man who was shot with an arrow while he was standing in prayer and didn't feel it. We have many confirmed reports like that. I'll just give you an example. There's been studies with Tibetan lamas. And I actually read one study, and I met a man who was actually one of the monks that did this study, the Dalai Lama's students. But in physiology, you have what's called a startle factor. Like if you hear a loud noise, you get a reaction, central nervous system, and you can't stop that reaction. So, people do that. You can't. If you get startled, people have different degrees. Some people really get scared. Other people, it's just, but they always notice certain things. Well, what they would do with these monks, when they would go into their deep meditation, they fired guns near them. They didn't notice. There was only a slight startle factor. And when they would come out of their meditation, they would ask them, "Did you hear anything?" And they would say, "I heard a very faint sound from a distance." So these types of aspects are not limited to Islam. You can have, in Hinduism, you have yogis that do certain practices and get into certain states. These are not limited to the Muslims. So there's actually scientific evidence for these types of phenomena. But what's interesting about this, and this is why I mentioned this last night, the reason it's considered a science is because there are states and stations that are replicable. If you repeat the processes, you will get the same results with sincerity, with niyyah. So in that way, there's an element to it which is experimental science. But obviously, there has to be belief in it. So this book deals with a little bit of both, and he begins it, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam taslima. Alhamdulillahi al-Aziz al-Wahhab, ملك الملوك ورب الأرباب الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب هدى وذكرى لأولي الألباب نحمده ونشكره وصلوات الله وسلامه وتحياته وبركاته على من دلنا على الله وبلغنا رسالة الله وجاء بالقرآن العظيم وبالآيات وذكر الحكيم وجاهد في الله حق الجهاد وبذل جهده في الحرص على نجاة العباد وعلم ونصح وبين وأوضح حتى قامت الحجة ولاحت المحجة وتبين الرشد من الغي وظهر الطريق الحق والصواب وانقشعت ظلمات الشيطان والارتياب ذلك سيدنا مولانا ونبينا وشفيعنا محمد النبي الأمي القرشي الهاشمي المختار من لباب اللباب والمصطفى من أطهر الأنساب وأشرف الأحزاب الذي أيده هو الله بالمعجزات الظاهرة والجنود القاهرة والسيوف الباترة جعله الله قائد الغر المحجلين والوجوه الناظرة فهو أول من يشفع يوم الحساب وأول من يدخل الجنة ويقرع الباب. Now, these introductions in this tradition are called dibaja. And dibaja is like when you ornament something. And so the books traditionally begin with this dibaja. And usually, most of the ulama make them very difficult to understand. They use a very high, rarefied literary language. Now, the reason that they do that is to keep uneducated people out of the books. And the reason for that is their belief was the worst thing that can happen is uneducated people get access to knowledge and don't understand it. And that's why they made the books difficult, with the exception to a certain degree of the Shafi'i madhab. The Shafi'i madhab tended to write books, they made them easy. Of all the madhabs, the Shafi'i madhab is probably the easiest to learn. But the Hanafis and Malikis were adamant about making their books almost impossible to understand, because they wanted to ensure that people did not get to that knowledge without going through the key. And the key was the Shaykh who studied with somebody who studied with somebody. And so most of these books are actually quite difficult, particularly in the beginning. And some of them get very easy. Like if you read the Shifa of Qadi Iyad, the first 4 or 5 pages, you can't understand a thing from it. It's just so difficult to understand. And you need a dictionary. But once you get past that, he put that there to stop people from reading his book, unless they knew what they were reading. And there's a story, one of the Yemeni sheikhs, a student of him, asked permission to read one of the philosopher sheikhs. And he said, no, I don't want you to read it. He said, Wallahi sheikh, I'll only take what I understand and I'll leave what I don't understand. And the sheikh said to him, I'm worried about what you think you understand. That's why I'd prefer you don't read the books. I'll give you an example. I read this thing about Ibn Abbas radhiyallahu anhu, وَكَانَ يَكْرَهُ الصَّمْتِ. Now, outwardly, that means that he didn't like silence. And that's what it means. But it wasn't. The word was a type of cloth that mixed silk and cotton. You know, that there's a famous story about the al-mu'minu kisu qatan. You know, they make that joke, but it's very true. You know, the believer is a box of cotton. It actually is kayyisun fatan. But if you change slightly the diacritical marks and things, it can be a box of cotton. And you have many examples of that. I'll give you one example. There was a man, and he actually claimed to be an Azhari. And he was giving fatwa. And I went with a friend of mine, Tarif al-Urabi, so he's actually a witness to this. And we were talking about the measuring the shadow and the fact that the prayer times, dhuhr in particular, is off in some parts of the United States because they're based on the NASA computer program, and they're basically standard time zones, and it's very difficult to get, you know, so you can be off by 10 minutes in some areas. So we measured over a period of time and found that dhuhr was off by a few minutes where we were. And he wanted to debate me about that. And I just asked him, I said, have you ever actually measured the way the Prophet ﷺ measured? And he said, yes. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, I took an anza and measured the dhil. Tarif al-Urabi was there with me, so I'm not making this story up. You know, you read about these things in books, like Hamqa wal Mughafalin, the books of fools and idiots. You read about this stuff, but when you actually see it, it's always amazing. So I said, you took anza? He said, yeah, which means a goat. And I said, you took anza and you measured the dhil? And he said, yeah, like the hadith says. And I said, but what about when it moved? He said, la thabbatna. You know, we held it down. Now, the word in the hadith is anaza with a fatha, which means a stick. I'm not making this up. I mean, I'm telling you a story I didn't read about. This happened to me. And Tarif al-Urabi, who, from Syria, people who know him, he's my witness. And at that point, I just said, Jazakallah khairan, and we left. And I said, did you hear that? He said, Wallahi, I heard it. He said, Subhanallah. The difference of the word is a fatha. And he read a book, obviously, and then he lied too, which bothered me. But he read a book, and he thought it said anza, and it didn't. It said anaza. Kana ya'khudu anazatan. He used to take a stick and measure the shadow with a stick. But the book didn't have a fatha, so he thought it was anza. It was a goat. It's just ridiculous. And that's why you get these fatwas now, about milking the lady. If you're working in an office, just drink her breast milk and she's a mahram for you. It's just unbelievable. Yeah, front page New York Times. I mean, it makes our religion look like it's an idiot's religion. La ilaha illallah. So that's why they do these. They start this dibaja to kind of get people out of the book that shouldn't be reading the book. So he says, praise be to Allah, Al-Aziz Al-Wahhab, 2 attributes. Malik al-Muluk, the King of Kings, is probably Malik al-Muluk. Wa Rabb al-Arbab, and the Lord of Lords. The one who revealed on his servant the book. And this is called saj'a. The Arabs like to have rhyme. The Arabs have 3 genres in their literature. They have the prose, nathar, which is prose, and then they have poetry, shi'r, and then the third is called saj'a, which is a rhymed prose. It's similar to what in the West now they call rap. It doesn't have a meter, but it has a rhyme, and they like that. They like the effect that it has. In English, you have alliteration and rhyme. They're rhetorical devices. So the Arabs like that a lot. And that's what he's doing here with, it's all ending with ab. Kitab, lubab, abwab, arbab. And then nahmaduhu wa nashkuru, we praise him and give thanks to him. And prayers and peace and greetings and blessings be upon the one who guided us to Allah and who delivered the message of Allah and came with this magnificent Quran and all of these signs and this wise reminder, and then struggled in the way of God in truth. So he struggled as one should struggle. And expended all of his energies due to his covetousness for the salvation of humanity. So his energy was expended because he wanted people to be saved. And he taught, and he was sincere in his advice, and he clarified, and he elucidated until the matter was clear, the proof was well established, the road was laid before us. And guidance was in clear contradistinction to deviation. And the road of truth manifested, and the darkness of shaitan was dispelled, and of doubt. And that is our master, and the Mawla is the one who really possesses you. So our master and our possessor, our prophet and our intercessor, Muhammad, the unlettered prophet, the Qurayshi, the Hashimi, the chosen one from the best of the best, the elected one from the purest of the lineages and the noblest of characters, the one who Allah has given ta'yeed, help with miracles manifest, with overcoming armies, and with the strength of weapons. Allah made him the leader of the Ghurr al-Muhajjalin. And those are the piebald. You have a horse that's called Ghurr Muhajjal, and it has the white on the forehead. And then the Muhajjal is down on the legs, it has the white. And it's something that some horses have that. The Prophet ﷺ said when he was asked, how will you know your ummah on the Day of Judgment? He said, because they'll be like these piebald horses, I'll see the light of wudu in their faces and on their hands and feet. So he'll know his ummah will be distinguished from other ummah because of this light that they have. And these illuminated faces. He is the first of those who are allowed to intercede on the day of reckoning, and the first who will enter paradise, and the first to knock on the door. فصلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه الأكرمين خير أهل وأكرم صحب وأصحاب صلاة زكية لا يحصر مقدارها العدد والحساب ولا يبلغ إلى وصفها ألسنة البلغاء ولا أقلام الفصحاء والكتاب. A prayer, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him benedictions, and upon his noble companions, the best of families, the noblest of companions, a purified prayer whose scope cannot be limited by number or reckoning, and nor can its description ever be reached by the tongues of the eloquent ones or the pens of the great writers and orators. أما بعد أيها المحب الصادق بمحبته. And as for what comes after, O you truthful lover, المحب الصادق بمحبته, the one whose love is sincere. He's assuming that if you're reading this book, which is called Tasfiyah al-Qulub, so he's assuming if you're reading a book entitled Tasfiyah al-Qulub في الوصول إلى حضرة علام الغيوب, the purification of the hearts in their journey of arrival to the presence of the one who knows the unseen. If you're reading this, then you're reading it because you want help on your journey. So he's assuming, and this is called husn al-dhann. It's having a good opinion of people. And it's one of the hallmarks of tasawwuf. And so he's beginning his book by already teaching you something about tasawwuf. He's saying, أيها المحب الصادق بمحبتي. Oh, you who are sincere in your love. That's his assumption about the reader of his book. So he's already letting you know that this is, I'm practicing what I'm preaching. Because this science is based on husn al-dhann billah wa husn al-dhann bi'ibadillah. The good opinion of Allah and the good opinion of the servants of Allah. That's something that, and that's something that we've lost, our community. We often assume the worst about people. If somebody's late, the assumption is they could care less about the appointment. What the Prophet said, one of the hallmarks of believers, يَلْتَمِسَ الْمَعَاذِيرِ. They look for excuses for people. And the munafiq is always looking to find faults in people. So it's something central to belief, is that people who believe have a good opinion of other people. Now, one of the things that in social sciences is that when you have expectations of people, they often will respond to your expectation. And I'll give you an example of that. There was a study done. They took a group of students that were all D students, and they put them in a class, and they told the teacher that these were the best students that they had last year. This was actually done in the U.S. And the teacher thought that they were all like GATE students, gifted children. That class ended up all becoming A students. Because the teacher's expectation was so high. And what often happens is when teachers look at students, how they behaved previously, they make the assumption, this is a C student. There's a kind of bell curve assumption about classes. Almost every teacher now, because the bell curve is such an idol in our culture. So there's an assumption that you're going to have a certain amount of A's, a certain amount of B's, a certain amount of C's, and a certain amount of D's, and a certain amount of F's. It's an assumption. And sure enough, every year, the tests and everything predict that. Now, when I took statistics at the university, I asked the professor, have they ever done a bell curve on the teachers to see if there were more A's in excellent teachers? You know, like, is the bell curve just confirming that C teachers have a majority of C students? So, and he said, yeah, that's a really good idea, you know, because people don't think of things from other dimensions. But generally what's found is excellent teachers often inspire students in classes, so they become better students because there's more motivation. And that's why having a good opinion of people is very important. There's a recent book that I think, this is something I've known intuitively, and I've also known from the Sunnah, and I really believe in it, and it's the way I've tried to raise my children. But the book is called A Case Against Adolescence by Robert Epstein. And he's a psychiatrist, and what he did is he studied the phenomenon of adolescent rebellion. And in looking at the social sciences, what he found is in countries where there really isn't an adolescence, when people reach puberty, they begin to be treated like adults. They don't have the phenomenon of teenage rebellion. And so he's come up with a theory that Robert Ellis, who is a well-known, I don't particularly like his school of psychology, but he's very, very well respected in emotive behavioral therapy. He's a very well respected psychiatrist, but he said it was the most revolutionary book he'd ever read. And what this man is arguing is that the reason young people are rebelling is because they're still being treated like children. John Taylor Gatto told me about a group of students that were in Harlem, and these were the worst students in this school. And they came in, they were all antisocial, they rebellious, had no respect for the teacher. And so what this teacher did is he made a deal with the principal of the school that he would teach his class at the junior college. And so these high school students would go to junior college. And he told them, I'm putting you guys in college. John Taylor Gatto told me that their behavior, the change in these young people just amazed this teacher. It was like an overnight, suddenly they wanted to behave like adults. They were in college. They didn't want to behave like punks anymore because they wanted to behave like the other college students. And so much of what's going on is just that assumption. If you expect these people to rebel and behave like children and you treat them with those assumptions, they respond in turn. Whereas if you have adult expectations of a 15-year-old, you'll be surprised. So there's so much in what we assume about other people. And that's why he's beginning this book like that. He is making the assumption that you are sincere in your love of God. It's it's beautiful. So he says, إن التصوف شيء يقذفه الله في قلوب أصفيائه. Tasawwuf is something that God thrusts into the hearts of those people of purity. وَهُوَ يُذَاقُ عَلَى يَدِّ أَهْلِهِ. And it's something that must be tasted at the hands of its people. So what he's saying, and this is Imam al-Ghazali who precedes him and is really one of the great formulators of this science. Imam al-Ghazali says that Tasawwuf is really about dhawq, which is tasting. And the reason they use that metaphor for this science is because there are certain things that you cannot explain to other people. They have to be tasted. And Imam al-Ghazali uses honey as his metaphor. He said, if somebody asks you what honey tastes like, the best way to help him understand is to give him a spoonful of honey. You can say it's sweet, but it's not like sugar. It's not like fruit. It's a distinct thing. And even though honeys are very different, there's something that all honeys share in common, that we place them into the jins or the genus of honey. There's different types of honey, but there's one genus. And so that's what he's saying, that this is something about tasting. And that's why the best way to taste this is to be in the company of its people, because you'll experience it from them. It's not something that you can really get from a book. A book can help you. It's like a map, but in the end you have to take the journey. The map's a waste of time. Borges, the Argentinian writer, has a story about a Chinese emperor that wants an exact map of China. And so every map they bring him, it's completely inadequate. So finally he decides to lay paper across all of China. So it's an exaggeration about the nature of maps. They're limited. They're always limited. You have to take the journey. That's the only way you're going to understand the terrain. You can read about desert, but you have to experience it. You have to see it. You can read about a maha, but once you see a maha, you'll understand why the Arabs, you read maha, it's a woman's name. Why would they name a woman after a wild oryx?
It's a gazelle.
Oryx is a type of gazelle. Yeah. Oryx is a type, it's a specific type. That's okay. But why they would name after the animal, you have to see it. And once you see it, oh, now I understand. It makes perfect sense. And that's experience. That's the difference of experience and a kind of book knowledge. The Arabs say everything has a portion of its name. Like whenever whatever you give a child. Yeah, that's why the Prophet said, choose good names for your children, because they'll get a portion of the name. And that's the nature of what name, the power of names. That's why the Prophet always changed bad names, negative names. So then he says, وَأَصْرُهُ نِعْمَ الصَّفَا وَالْوَفَا وَالْمَحَبَّةَ الصَّادِقَةِ مَحَلَّ الْقُرْبِ بِالْمُصْطَفَى. Its foundation is the blessing of purity and loyalty, of fulfilling your oath and promise. And true love, and its place is in nearness to the Prophet ﷺ. So that's really what this is about. It's about those things that he described. وَأَمَّا تَصَوُّفْ فَلَهُ تَعَلُّقٌ بِالْقُرْآنِ. As for tasawwuf, it has a connection with the Quran. In other words, this is a Quranic science. And that's why what's interesting about this book and why I really like it is he took it entirely from the Quran. Because there's people that claim tasawwuf is something outside of Islam. They borrowed it from the Hindus, they borrowed it from the Buddhists, they borrowed it. And there's some truth to those elements. There's definitely within some of the turuq of the Sufiyah, they borrowed things from other traditions. That's just fact. But the science is a Quranic science. And that's why he wrote this book, to really show that. لما ورد في القرآن من المعارف الإلهية ورياضة النفوس وتنوير القلوب وتطهيرها باكتساب الأخلاق الحميدة واجتناب الأخلاق الذميمة. Because we see that in the Quran, many divine knowledges have come, and also the disciplining of the souls, the illumination of the hearts, the purification of the hearts, by acquiring virtuous character and by avoiding vice. So this وَقَدْ تَكَلَّمَتْ الْمُتَصَوِّفَةُ فِي تَفْسِيرِ الْقُرْآنِ. And the Sufis spoke and interpreted the Quran themselves. So they spoke about tafsir al-Quran. فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ أَحْسَنَ وَأَجَادَ ووصل بنور بصيرته إلى دقائق المعاني والرشاد ووقف على حقيقة المراد ومنهم من توغل في المعاني الباطنة وحمل القرآن على ما لا تقتضيه اللغات العربية. وقد جمع أبو عبد الرحمن السلمي كلامهم في التفسير في كتابه الذي سماه الحقائق. So some of them made their own tafsir, and some of them sunk deeply into this and arrived at realities of the Quran, their desired realities. And among them are those who got tawaghala, is to really get stuck in esoteric meanings, and they basically attempted to explain the Quran in ways that the Arabic language does not allow. So they went beyond the boundaries. And he says al-lughat al-arabiyya, which is a plural, because in tafsir there are many ways to interpret a word, and the mufassir will look at the different ways. And one of the qawa'id of tafsir, the principles in tafsir, is that any meaning that is sound in Arabic and in accordance with the grammar, the syntax, and the rules of the Arabic language, and can be proven, is an acceptable interpretation of the Quran. As long as it's not a ta'wil ba'id, where something's just far-fetched, but if the Arabic تحتمله العربية, if the Arabic contains that and it's not far-fetched, then it's an acceptable way of looking at that verse. And that's why you have primary meanings, secondary, tertiary meanings. So that's an important aspect of the science. And Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, he's one of the great scholars. He was born in 325. He wrote in hadith, in tafsir. He's very well known. But he wrote a book and gathered all of the different opinions of the Sufis up to his time, and he called it al-Haqa'iq, the realities. وقال بعض العلماء, and some of the ulama said, بل هي البواطل. No, it's really the falsities. Now look what he says. وإذا أنصفنا, but if we're fair, قلنا فيه حقائق وبواطل. It has realities and it has falsities. So, and this is the beauty of the great ulama of Islam. One of the things about lesser ulama is that if they don't like something, they reject the whole thing. And every book has mistakes. I was once in the United Arab Emirates years ago, and there was a mufassir from Mauritania, Shaykh Talib al-Khiyar. And his name was Shaykh. He was born as a Shaykh. In Mauritania, they don't use the word Shaykh. Like I have a son named Shaykh. I named him after one of my teachers. In Mauritania, they name their children Shaykh because they have high infant mortality rate. Shaykh means old man. It's a hope that they grow old. So his mother named him Shaykh, Talib Khiyar. And when the Mauritanians moved to the east, they get the title Shaykh, like Shaykh Abdullah. In Mauritania, he wouldn't be called Shaykh Abdullah. He'd be called Murabit Abdullah, because they use the word Murabit instead of Shaykh. So he used to say to the Mauritanians, he said, you didn't become shuyukh until you moved to the east. He said, I was born a Shaykh. But one day we were in a gathering and somebody asked him, if you were on a desert island and you could only have one tafsir, which would you take? And he said al-Jalalain. It was very simple. Not simple, but it's very short tafsir. He said al-Jalalain? He said, Naam. And then he said, but there's some mistakes in that, isn't there? And Shaykh Talib al-Khiyar looked at it and he said, Allah will never allow a book to be written other than his book without mistakes in it. Every book that humans have written has mistakes in it. Simple as that. So he says, if we were fair, we would say it has realities and falsities. And I mentioned earlier, وقلت في هذا الكتاب ما يستحسنه من الإشارة الصوفية دون ما يتعرض أو يقدح فيه. In this book, I am going to mention only those things that are appropriate, that are good indications from the Sufis. This is called ishara. And that's why in tafsir you have ishara. Tafsir bil ishara is to take meanings out of the... I'll give you an example of tafsir al-ishari. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. Omar was in a gathering and Ibn Abbas was there, and we just visited Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. So بالمناسبة, Omar said to the Sahaba, what do you say about this verse? And the Sahaba said, well, it's Fathu Mecca. When Fath Mecca came and all the people came into Islam, then the Prophet should ask forgiveness and praise God. And each one of them said, most of them, they all said it had that meaning. And then he looked at Ibn Abbas and he said, what do you say it means? He said, it is Allah telling the Prophet that his death is nearing. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. When your ajal comes. That's the real nasr of God, to die a believer. And that is the great opening because everything is unveiled. Then at that time, ask forgiveness and glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when he said that, that's an ishara. When he said that, Umar said, that's what I understand from it also. So an ishara is something that the outward, it's not apparent. It's something that's indicated, but it needs to be derived from it. And you need to dig deeper. And that's why Sayyidina Umar, when he would say to Ibn Abbas, he would ask him a question about Quran or fiqh or something. And he used to say, Ghus ghawas. Dive deep, you diver. You know, ghawas is the one that goes to get the pearls in the ocean. You know, in the Arabian Peninsula, they had the ghawas is the one that dives to get the pearls. So he would say that to Ibn Abbas, dive deep, diver. So then he says, and these are, you will find no opposition or objection to what I'm going to mention. In other words, this is Quranic tasawwuf. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm not going to bring things that people can find objections. So I'm going to give you something that every Muslim should agree on because it's taken directly from the Quran. قال الشيخ الفقيه العالم العلامة المتفنن المفسر إمام عصره وقطب وقته الصوفي المحقق السيد أبو عبد الله محمد المدعو بأبو القاسم ابن أحمد ابن محمد ابن جوزي الكلبي الأندلسي الغرناطي رحمه الله تعالى ورضي الله عنه ونفعنا به وبأمثاله قال في تفسيره الذي سماه كتاب التسهيل لعلوم التنزيل. So the Shaykh, the Faqih, the Alim, the scholar, the Allama, exaggerated form of alim, somebody who is not just an alim, but he has gone to the extreme of knowledge. Al-Mutafanni, somebody who's mutafannin is he knows many, many different things. So it's like a Renaissance scholar. Al-Mufassir, the one who explains the Quran. Imam Asrihi, the scholar of his age, the leader of his age. Qutubu waqtihi, the qutub is that around which everything revolves. So he's the scholar of his time around which knowledge revolved. Al-Sufi, and this is a laqab that people got who were known to have spiritual presence and states. And Imam al-Bukhari, if you read al-Bukhari, you'll see that laqab in some of the rijal. So it was an early laqab that people got. It's not like an innovation, even though some people are very posted. The muhaqqiq is the one who really examines and goes into great detail, the scholar of detail. Sayyid Abu Abdullah, that's his kunya, the father of Abdullah. Muhammad, the one called Abu al-Qasim, the son of Ahmad, the son of Muhammad, Ibn Juzayy. So from a tribe of the Arabs. Al-Kalbi is his tribe, Bani Kalb, which is a tribe here in the Arabian Peninsula. And Al-Andalusi, so he was from Andalus. Al-Granati, from Granada, which is a famous city in Andalusia. It was a city known for scholars and craftsmen, and it was the last citadel of Islam in Spain. It's what fell in 1492 when the Nasrid dynasty lost it to Ferdinand and Isabella after 2 years of actually being surrounded. So they held out for 2 years, a city, a walled city. He said in his tafsir, which is called a tasheel, the facilitation in the knowledges of revelation, قد تكلمنا أيضا على 12 مقاما من مقام التصوف. I spoke in my tafsir about 12 stations from the stations of tasawwuf. في مواضعها من القرآن, in the appropriate places from the Quran. فتكلمنا على الشكر في القرآن. I spoke about gratitude in the Fatiha when I did tafsir of the Fatiha. لما بين الحمد والشكر من الاشتراك, because of the relationship between gratitude and praise. Because Allah begins the book, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin. So Alhamdulillah, Hamd and Shukr are related. So he's saying that I mentioned this maqam of Shukr in the Fatiha. And then وتكلمنا على التقوى في قوله تعالى في البقرة هدى للمتقين. And then I spoke about taqwa in Baqarah when I mentioned it's a guidance for the people of taqwa. وعلى الذكر في قوله فيها فاذكروني أذكركم. And then I spoke about remembrance of God when Allah says remember me and I will remember you. وعلى الصبر في قوله فيها وبشر الصابرين. And on patience in Allah's word when He said give good tidings to the people who are of patience. وعلى التوحيد في قوله فيها وإلهكم إله واحد. And I spoke about Tawheed in Allah's word in the Quran when He said, your God is one God. إله واحد. وعلى محبة الله في قوله فيها والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله. And I spoke about love of God in the divine word when He said, and those who believe in God have greater love of God than even the idolaters have for their idols. وعلى التوكل في قوله في آل عمران. And I spoke about trust and dependence on God in the verse in Ali Imran, فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ. And once you have firmly decided a matter, then trust in God. وَعَلَى الْمُرَاقَبَةِ فِي قَوْلِهِ فِي النِّسَاءِ. And I spoke about vigilance and awareness of God and God's presence in His divine word mentioned in An-Nisa, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلَيْكُمْ رَقِيبًا, that God is constantly aware and watching you. وَعَلَى الْخَوْفِ وَالرَّجَاءِ فِي قَوْلِهِ فِي الْأَعْرَافِ. And I spoke about fear and hope in the divine word mentioned in Al-A'raf, the heights. وَادْعُوهُ خَوْفًا وَطَمَعًا. And call on Him out of fear and out of hope. وَعَلَى التَّوْبَةِ فِي قَوْلِهِ فِي النُّورِ. And I spoke about Tawbah in His mention in the chapter of light. وَتُوبُوا إِلَى اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. And turn altogether to Allah. وَعَلَى الْإِخْلَاصِ فِي قَوْلِهِ فِي الْبَيِّنَةِ. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ. And I spoke about sincerity in Surah Al-Bayyinah in the divine word, and they were only commanded to worship God with absolute sincerity. وأما أصول الدين فتتعلق بالقرآن من طريقين. أحدهما ما ورد في القرآن من إثبات العقائد وإقامة البراهين عليها والرد على أصناف الكفار والأحزاب والطوائف المختلفة من المسلمين. تعلق بالقرآن وكل طائفة منهم تحتج لمذهبها في القرآن وترد على من خالفها وتزعم أنه خالف القرآن، ولا شك أن منهم المحقة والمبطلة، ومعرفة تفسير القرآن توصل في ذلك إلى التحقيق مع التسديد والتأييد من الله والتوفيق وهو حسبي ونعم الوكيل. So that's the introduction. He says, as for creed, usul al-din, the basis of our religion, which is the creed, what we believe, the aqidah. He says, this is also related to the Quran based on for two reasons, or in two ways. The first of them is because of what has been mentioned in the Quran in affirmation of our beliefs and in establishing the proofs of what we believe. And then in refutation of the various types of kuffar and the types of sects that you have in the world, and the different groups from amongst the Muslimin. Every single group has held to the Quran. See, all the groups that are people of deviation, heresy, all these different groups, every one of them holds to the Quran. Every one of them proves his school based on the Quran. And he refutes those who disagree with him based on the Quran. And he claims that they're the ones that are going against the Quran. And there's no doubt that amongst them are people that have truth with them and others that are false. So knowing the tafsir of Quran, the interpretation of Quran, is what will enable you to realize what is sound and accurate. And Allah gives tawfiq. Success is with God. He is enough for me, and He's the best of protectors. So, to go back to Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, Ibn Abbas was once asked by Sayyidina Umar, the Prophet told us that this ummah would fall into sects, because he said, افترقت اليهود على 71 فرقة وافترقت النصارى على 72 فرقة وستفترق أمتي على 73 فرقة كلها في النار إلا واحدة. The Jews split into 71 sects, the Christians into 72 sects, and my ummah will split into 70 sects, 71, 72, and my ummah will split into the 72 sects. And he said all of them are in the fire except for one. And there's another riwayah which is Hasan, all of them are in paradise except for one. And they're both correct. Because one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali says is in many hadiths, and this is something many groups have gone astray with, in many hadiths where it says people are in the fire, it means they warrant the fire. In other words, they deserve to go to the fire, but it doesn't mean they're going to the fire, because the Prophet intercedes for people. And so that's very important to understand. So Imam al-Ghazali said that all of the Muslims will be in paradise eventually, with the exception of one group, and they're the heretics, people that have just gone out of the pale of Islam. But people will have to go through purification. Some it'll be on Yawm al-Qiyamah, others it'll be on the Sirat, and others will spend time according to the sound hadith. So what he's saying here, Ibn Abbas said, Sayyidina Umar asked him, why is it that if we have the Quran and we read the Quran and we see it before us, how can we go astray? And Ibn Abbas said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, don't you see how every verse that was revealed, we were there when it was revealed. We knew the conditions in which it was revealed. We understood its meanings and its context. There'll be people that come after us that won't know those things. And they'll read the Quran and they'll assume things about what's being said, and they'll misunderstand it. And each one will follow his own opinion, and that will lead to dissension, and the dissension will lead to fighting. And that is why there are knowledges that you have to have before you can interpret the Quran. One of them is asbab al-nuzul. So that's what he's talking about. Every group deviates with the Quran. There's a group that said that people have absolute free will. So they took لَهَا مَا كَسَبَتْ وَعَلَيْهَا مَا اكْتَسَبَتْ, and they left وَمَا رَمَيْتْ إِذْ رَمَيْتْ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. You didn't throw when you threw, but God threw. الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. He created you and your actions. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ. You don't will anything except Allah wills it. There's another group that said we're completely determined. We have no free will. They took those verses and they ignored لَهَا مَا كَسَبَتْ وَعَلَيْهَا مَا اكْتَسَبَتْ. It has what it earned and it has against it what. So every group goes astray by taking some of the Quran without a holistic understanding of the Quran. And that's why in this science in particular, it's important to adhere to the Quran, because people can really go astray in this science, because so much of it is experiential. And people have experiences, and they, like I mentioned yesterday, you get psychotic episodes, you get people that think that they're above the Sharia. There's people that said, the Quran says, أَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيكَ الْيَقِينَ. Worship Allah until you get certainty. And I have yaqeen now, so I don't have to pray. There's people that said that. Imam al-Junayd was asked about a group of people that claimed to be people who arrived, and they said, we don't have to pray anymore. And he said, Na'am, wasaru. Indeed, they did arrive. Wasaru ila jahannam. They arrived to hell. So, jazakumullah khairan. It's been a long day. اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين إن شاء الله ووفقنا وإياكم إلى ما يحب ويرضى. Inshallah, may Allah bless all the people that are responsible for us and taking care of us. Inshallah, bless Aisha Subhani and her family, and Fredun and Asad and all the helpers and people and our teachers. May Allah bless Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya for being with us. He hasn't been feeling very well, but mashallah, he's haris, it makes him really happy to see all of you. So may Allah bless him and Shaykh Abdullah al-Qadi and Shaykh Walid and Sidi Yahya and all the teachers. Inshallah, facilitate Imam Zayd's coming and Shaykh Jamal and others. جزاكم الله خيرا. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.